Greetings everyone and welcome to this webinar. Today we will be discussing about minimizing the documents needed for an environmental management system. My name is Erica Rios, the PCB organizer of this webinar, and our guest for today is Ms. Debra Hampton, PCB Certified Trainer for ISO 9001, ISO 14001, and OXAS 18001. Please write your questions and comments in the question box in the right hand of the control panel, and Debra will answer them to you accordingly. Please, Debra, you may start the presentation.
Good morning or good evening, wherever you are in the world. This presentation today is on minimizing the documents needed for an environmental management system. I have been working many years as a third-party auditor of ISO 9001 systems, 14001 systems, as well as the 18001 OSAS systems. I've begun to see a trend that is minimizing the documentation, and I want to share that with you and encourage you to question why you have some of the documents that you currently have in your system. I'm going to, if you have any questions, again, reminding you, please type those questions in, and I'll try to address them either during the presentation or, if necessary, I will wait until the end of the presentation. If I'm speaking too rapidly, please make sure that you do send in a comment so that I will slow down. The first thing I'm going to do is to remind you of the documentation requirements of ISO 14001-2004. As many of you know, the standard is changing and we will be getting a new version, and I'll discuss that in just a moment. Let's look at just the requirements in the current standard. There's a requirement that we have a documented policy, documented objectives and targets. Excuse me. We must document our aspects, the roles, responsibilities, and authorities for dealing with those aspects. We have to document any methods for communication with external interested parties. We must document if we are going to make a decision to not communicate or to communicate with those the environmental aspects with our community. We must document our scope. We must describe the main elements of the environmental management system and their interaction and reference to related documents. We must determine the records necessary, and notice that I have underlined that word, necessary, and it is to ensure the records necessary to ensure the effective planning, operation, and control of processes. We must have documented procedures where their absence would lead to deviation from the environmental policy, objectives, and targets, and we must document information to monitor the performance. Not once in the documentation requirements of ISO 14001 does it state that we need a manual. Not once does it state that we need any documented procedures. Many of us probably have them in our systems currently, but it's not a requirement of the standard. Well, let's look and see what the hey, let me change to the next slide. There's a slight delay, so I'm waiting for it to make the change to the next slide. Erica, do you have any idea why it's not moving? Okay, those who are attending, I'm going to open this again and see if we can't get the slide to move, because I'd like for you to see the next slide. In our 14,001-2004, it also has some required records, training records, calibration, verification of monitoring and measuring. All of these are familiar to you. Records of evaluations of compliance, corrective actions, preventive actions, internal audits, and management review. Again, no requirement for a quality manual. Let's look at the documentation requirements for 14,001-2015. Now, this is still in the draft version, so this is subject to change, but since the 2004 didn't have a requirement for a manual, look over these and you will see that they're very similar in requirements to the documentation for the 2004, but once again, there isn't a requirement for a manual or any documented procedures. It does say that we need to have sufficient documentation necessary to have confidence that the process has been planned. So there is a requirement to have documentation necessary to have confidence, but it doesn't say that there's a requirement to have a procedure. So, looking on through these requirements, we still don't see that requirement for our manual or documented procedures. If a manual isn't required and there aren't any documented procedures required, then what do we do? Because we still have to have some glue to hold our system together. Well, let's look at the standard. Let's look at the table of the contents of the standard to guide us. As you know, that 1 through 4.1 are basically informative clauses of our standard. It's telling us the scope of the standard, any normative references, and any terms and definitions that we need. Then 4.1 general requirements is just introducing us to some of the generic requirements for the environmental management system. 4.2 then describes our requirements for creating an environmental policy, which we said was a requirement of the standard, documenting that environmental policy. Also in that section, you'll find that it's a requirement to document our objectives. Then we get into planning, and it says we must plan, but no requirement for a documented procedure. Implementation and operation. We must implement and we must operate, but there's no requirement for a documented procedure. Checking. We must check. We must do management review. So let's look at this standard and see what we could do that still meets these requirements. Let's think just a moment before we move on. I'm sure many of you are questioning how this can be true, since you have manuals and you have procedures, and how could you do it? I want to make just a comment here that the standard was established based on best practices. They are practices that have been proven over time. If it had been proven that a manual was needed, don't you think it would be a requirement in the standard? If it was proven that documented procedures were needed, then wouldn't it be a requirement in the standard? Remember, the standard does require that we document a policy and objectives, but when we do, our documented policy needs to be simple, such as, for environment, do as little harm as possible. Pursue a smaller footprint. Those are both very generic but simple policies. I try to tell my clients that if you have a policy that has more than 10 words, people can't remember more than 10 words. Some people can, that's not my gift. So a policy should be very simple. Objectives, the natural place to keep those documented is in your management review. Objectives should change. They're not to be written in stone. They're new goals for that year. They're new objectives for that year. Remember, they must be specific and measurable. An example might be that we want to reduce our energy consumption by 10% every year for the next 10 years. Or reduce the pounds sent to the landfill. Reduce hazardous waste cost. Those are kinds of examples from my experience in what might be good, simple objectives. And those could easily be documented in your management review meeting minutes. So now, we also must document the scope, the boundaries of the environmental management system, and we must describe the main elements of the environmental management system and their interaction and reference to related documents. So let's draw a picture of the interaction of the processes. Here's an example diagram describing the interaction of processes in one of the organizations that I have worked with. Matter of fact, it's my organization. By process, I list the activities conducted in my facility. I then determine aspects of each activity that could adversely affect the environment. I then harvest from this list of aspects and create a list of aspects. I set criteria to determine which could be considered the most significant. I then establish controls, designate roles and responsibilities. Examples of controls might be training. I must make sure that certain people are competent. Communication may be a control I use. Documentation might be a control I use. Emergency drills. Even monitoring and measuring. To support the system, I ensure the processes are adequate and effective by internal auditing of planned arrangements and compliance auditing. I perform management reviews. I periodically verify legal requirements have not changed. Notice that this also includes my policy, which is minimize harm to the environment, and my scope, which is the EMS of XYZ company as they manufacture widgets. This is page 1 of my EMS system. It's a one-page document. It tells and describes how we manage our EMS. There are documents that are required, so we just saw page 1 of our EMS. And if you would like a copy of that, I'll be glad to email it to you. If you send an email to me through the link that's above. We also have to document our aspects, the roles, responsibilities, and authorities, communication from external interested parties, decisions to communicate externally significant environmental aspects. So there are things that we still need to document. The main elements, we need to, which this is what we've just done. The records required, so we're going to need to document our records, and a documented procedures where their absence could lead to a deviation from our policy objectives and targets. That's the only time is when we need to control the situation, and the documented information to monitor performance. So How could we address those documentation requirements? Let's look at what would be page 2 of our EMS system. We could create a document with columns to address each one. Think in terms of columns and rows. Think in terms of an Excel spreadsheet that has the column headings of aspect, impact, controls, roles, responsibilities, authorities, and the record retention requirements. So let's look at an example of this. One main document where the aspects are rows, the impacts are in the next column, and then what we do is a control. So for stormwater, the control is that once a quarter we're going to use the collection form, and we must also do annual training for our employees. So, who is responsible? Our EHS coordinator, and their responsibility is to collect samples, report annually, escalate to top manager if it fails, and then to sign on behalf excuse me, of the organization. You can see that this one main document becomes page 2 of our EMS. Other pages of your EMS will be the controls used. Notice that some of the words in the controls happen to be bold and italicized. Those are documents that are used as control. So they are the other pages of your EMS. If you have documents that are not listed in this column as a control, then why do you have the document? I'm going to say that again. If you have documents that are not listed here as a control, it's not necessary to control your your environmental management system, then why do you have that document? One of the ways that you might document the controls used might be process maps, check sheets, or forms to document information gathered. I encourage you to use process maps instead of procedures, and hopefully we'll get to do another webinar on process mapping at another date through PECB, so we look forward to you attending those. I want to begin to close with 2 comments. Most of you would recognize the gentleman in the silver hair as Richard Branson, who is the CEO of Virgin. He says, complexity is your enemy. Any fool can make something complicated. It is hard to make something simple. I also want to remind you of a statement by Albert Einstein. He said, any intelligent fool can make things bigger and more complex. It takes a touch of genius and a lot of courage to move in the opposite direction. Now, I don't know how you are, but I may not have much genius, but I have a lot of courage. And when I read the standard, I see what it requires. And I have enough courage to state that those are the only requirements of the standard. And since those are the only requirements of the standard, then I have enough courage to say that there is no reason for me to have a manual or documented procedures unless they are a control. Simple is better. It is easier to read. It's easier to communicate to others. It's easier to follow. And it's easier to edit when needed. Any of you who have managed an EMS system, I'm sure would agree with me. If you need anything from me as you continue to think and ponder, please contact me at the email that is on your screen now, Debra@ce-q.com. Request things from me. You can also go to my website, which is www.ce-q.com. I have free documents there, and if you don't find them, then please be sure and contact me, and I will be glad to send to you what you are looking for. Let me also remind you that when you start auditing minimally documented systems, they're easier to audit, they're quicker to audit, they save investments in auditing time, and you have more confidence in your audit results because you have enough time to cover every requirement. I want to thank you for participating today. I hope that you will begin the trail, the journey, to minimize the documents that are in your environmental management system. And I want to thank PECB.com for allowing me to be a part of this presentation. And I open the floor now for your questions. Thank you, Erica.
Thank you very much, Debra. We really enjoyed your presentation, and I also want to thank all the attendees for taking your time and attending this webinar. We hope that you enjoy it and it's been useful for you. Let me just check at the questions. Okay, here is one question from Edward. What is the difference between documentation and procedure? Could you answer that question now? Because we have some time.
Yes. A procedure is a method. You have a method for getting ready in the mornings. You have a procedure, a method for getting to work in the mornings. The difference between a document and a procedure is you don't have a documented procedure for how you get ready to go to work. You follow a method.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think that answers your question, the question. Thank you very much, Debra. And if there is any further question, they can email it to you directly, and you will answer them personally, as we talked before. So please check PECB's webinar schedule on our website, www.pecb.com, or our official social media network. Since next week, we will be organizing more webinars on very interesting topics. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending the webinar, and looking forward to see you soon. Thank you, Debra.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.